Hi, today we're going to make a gathered sample. When would you use gathering? Well, when you make ruffles, party dresses, prom dresses, after 5, blouses that have like a ruffled sleeve. Here's a little girl's dress that's ruffled, and you can see that this fabric is gathered here and attached at the bottom of the dress. This one has 2 layers. So we're going to learn today how to do this gathering that's across the middle of this. To make the ruffle that's going to be gathered and attached to a sample, we're going to use one of your 4x9 samples that's one color, and then you want your gathered piece to be a different color. It'll be easier to work with. And I'm going to take 2 of these green pieces of fabric, and I'm going to make a plain seam right here so that this piece of fabric is twice as long as the piece I'm going to attach it to. So I'm just going to make a little seam. Most of the time when I do ruffles, I do a little French seam so that if the ruffle flips up, it looks really nice underneath. And so you want to make this a permanent seam. So I've back tacked the top and the bottom of it. And I would press this open. So this seam will be pressed open. So then what we will do next is we're going to put 2 rows of stitching on the edge of the ruffle where it's going to attach to the dress. And you want to use 2 rows of thread so that when you draw it up and gather it, you get nice even gathers, and you're not having to sort of play with them to try to get them to lay right. It will lay right with the 2 rows of stitching. So one thing that you want to do is you want to think about the stitch length. The smaller the stitch length, the harder it's going to be to gather it up, but you don't want it to be too big because you don't want it to pleat. So I'm going to make sure that my stitch length is at 3.5 or maybe 4, somewhere in there. So I've changed this to 3.5. And I like to be able to draw that bobbin thread easily. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll reduce my tension on the thread. And then we're going to sew 2 rows. Now, this is a 5/8 inch seam. We don't want to see any thread on the outside of the garment. So I don't want to sew right on the 5/8 and hope I'm going to be able to hit the seam just right. I'm going to go down to about a 1/2 inch and then a 1/4 inch and have those 2 rows of threads next to each other. Now, because we're going to be moving this thread in this sample, we don't want to back tack it. It's we need to be able to pull the threads to gather it up. So you're just going to put it under the sewing machine, and I'm going to put this at about 1/2 inch. And I'm going to run a row of stitching all the way down my fabric. I'm going to check to make sure that the seam is pressed open. I want it open. I don't want it to fold over on itself and be lumpy. And you're going to leave a tail at the end. So when I pull this out, I don't want to cut it right here because then I won't be able to pull it. I'm going to cut it here. I'm going to leave a little tail. Then I'm going to sew another row of stitching right next to it. And I'm going to leave these little tails at the end too. And I'm just going to push these out of the way so that I don't accidentally stitch them. So I'm going to do a row of stitching right next to it. You want to be super careful that you don't cross over and cross back, because then you won't be able to gather your sample up. So I'm going to have 2 rows of stitching here. Again, when I get to where the seam is, see how it's popping up? I want to make sure that this stays flat underneath. So I'm just going to put my finger on it as it feeds in. I'm not going to let it flip over on me. And I'm going to go all the way to the end and leave another generous tail. So we've got this 2 rows of stitching that we're going to be able to gather up the fabric. Before you go forward, if you did change your tension, make sure you put it back. You don't want to forget that. I'm going to make sure I have some tails hanging out the back of the machine here. And I'm going to be attaching this fabric, that's the gathered ruffle. We'll pretend that this is a bodice of a dress or a skirt. I want them to be evenly spaced out, the gathering. You don't want to have a lot of gathering at one end and then nothing at the other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this in half, and I'm going to just make maybe a little nick right there so that I know where my halfway spot is. So when you nick stuff, don't make a big slashy cut. I want to, oops, let me get this right. I want to just insert my scissors and maybe get a little 1/8 of an inch of a nick. So I'm nicking it there. So this will be a little mark that tells me on this piece of fabric, it's the halfway mark. That halfway mark is going to line up with that seam that we made. So now I know I'm going to gather the same amount of fabric on this side as I am on this side. So I generally like to pin that spot first. And again, you can see that my pins are in the opposite direction that I'm going to be sewing. And then what I'm going to do is go to the end here where I've made those 2 rows of stitching, and I'm going to take the 2 threads that are on this side of the fabric. I'm going to leave those hanging down the back. Don't grab them wrong, or once you start, don't grab the other ones, because when you pull that, you'll lock the stitching and you won't be able to gather. So what we're going to do is we're just going to pull those threads and we're going to gather this fabric up. So you can see I'm getting nice little gathers. I'm going to go all the way to the center area. You want to be careful as you're pulling it that you don't break the threads. So I'm going across. And I'm going to gather this up. So let's see, is it the same length as the other side? No, it's still a bit longer. So I'm going to press a little bit more. And then I'm going to attach this here with a pin. I want to make sure I've gathered up enough. Oh, it could go a little bit more, so I'm going to pull a little bit more. And then I like to take these 2 threads and I just do a figure 8 around the pin so that it doesn't come out, and then I've got to do it again. And so then you want to adjust your gathers. You want to try to balance them out so that you have an even amount. So then you're going to go ahead and do the other side. Okay, so we're going to press this gathered seam. And a lot of times what's a good idea to do first is to, see if we can get it so you can see it, is to sort of press the seam while it's still flat. And you don't want to press your ruffles over here because you're just going to put little pleats in them. So we just kind of want to press along the edge there and sort of flatten this out. Some people like to press all their seams flat before they press them open because it actually sets the thread. I worked for a fashion designer years ago that had a fit if I didn't press it first before I pressed it open. So everybody has their own little idiosyncrasies of how they like to do things. So we're going to press the dress up away from the ruffle. And to press it flat, you're going to have to really smooth it out and hold it. So watch your fingers with the iron. A lot of times what I do is I sort of pull on the ruffle and I'm just running my iron along the edge. If you don't pull down on it, you're going to have, again, that little rolled edge to a seam, and it's not going to look as nice. So there we have it. There's our little ruffle. That's what it looks like on the back. So mark it as your gathered sample, and then we have another sample that we're going to create here in a minute.